All right. Well, we have started live streaming, so I think we are officially starting here tonight. Again, welcome. Welcome to the South Dakota Festival of Books. We are so excited that you could join us tonight. I am Kelly Kirk from the South Dakota Humanities Council. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Humanities Council, which produces the annual Festival of Books. We're so pleased you've joined us for our virtual 2021 event. We would like to acknowledge, first and foremost, that this program comes to you from ground, which is the homeland of the Oceti-Sakowin, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. The South Dakota Humanities Council honors and appreciates the Indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Before this event gets underway, I'd like to share just a few housekeeping details. We ask that you keep your microphone muted throughout the event to minimize background noise. If you'd like to ask questions or share comments with today's presenters, please type them in the chat section on Zoom, which you can open by clicking on the conversation bubble at the bottom of your screen or in the comment section on Facebook. We will pass along as many as possible. If you wish, we will also allow you to unmute at the end of the session so you can ask your questions directly. We encourage you to buy books by our presenting authors at your local independent bookstore. Our official festival booksellers are Books A Million and the Birdcage Bookstore Mercantile, both in Rapid City. You can also buy directly from authors and publishers and look for those links in the chat. To help us to continue to improve the festival, we'd appreciate your filling out an evaluation form. We'll share a link in the chat section on Zoom, and we'll also email you a link to this survey at the conclusion of the festival. Finally, you can help keep the festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. Just visit our website, sdhumanities.org, and click the donate button. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of our festival guide and on our website. And now, on with the show. This program is called Spotlight on HERstorical Fiction. Joining us tonight, we have Melanie Benjamin, the author of the New York Times and USA Today best-selling historical novels, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, The Aviator's Wife, and Mistress of the Ritz. Her latest, The Children's Blizzard, is the 2021 One Book South Dakota, offering a deeply researched, fictionalized take on the deadly storm that swept through Dakota territory in January of 1888. An Indiana native, Benjamin lives on the East Coast and puts her theatrical training to use at literary events. Also joining us is Ariel Lawhon, a critically acclaimed best-selling author of historical fiction books, including I Was Anastasia and Codename Helene. Her novels have been translated into numerous languages and have been library reads, One Book, One County, Indie Next, Costco, Amazon Spotlight, and Book of the Month Club selections. Lawhon lives in the rolling hills outside Nashville, Tennessee, with her husband and 4 sons. She splits her time between the grocery store and the baseball field. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Same.
Wonderful. Well, I think maybe just to get started, would you both like to just kind of talk about your latest work and kind of introduce that to our audience?
Sure. Okay, well, alphabetical order, I guess. So yeah, I'm so happy to be speaking with you. I really had a wonderful time this summer doing a lot of the virtual events through the South Dakota Humanities program, talking about the Children's Blizzard with so many great libraries. So a little bit about the Children's Blizzard, in case you don't know, it is about a novel. It is a historical novel about the deadly 1888 blizzard that struck on January 12th. And impacted your area, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota. And it was a devastating blizzard known to history as the Children's Blizzard because it struck right when school was letting out on those prairie school houses. And it was a day that had dawned very warm, and the blizzard kind of struck out of nowhere. People were not prepared. School teachers as young as 15 and 16, children themselves, basically had to make life and death decisions. Should they send the children home or keep them inside structures that were not able to withstand a night of cold. And so the novel I fictionalized the characters, two sisters, Gerda and Raina, two school teachers who make different decisions, and how those decisions impact their lives and the lives of their pupils for the rest of, for the rest of their days. And there are also some other characters in there that I've somewhat based on some of the real survivors of the storm. And it's just a great big epic kind of survival story that also follows the aftermath of the storm and how these decisions impact everyone's lives. So that's a little bit about the Children's Blizzard.
Thank you.
Mine is called Codename Helene, and it is based on the true story of a woman named Nancy Wake. She was an Australian expat traveling abroad who found herself in Paris, France, right before the outbreak of World War II. She had just bluffed her way into a reporting job with Hearst newspapers. And her first assignment as a journalist was to go interview the newly appointed German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. That interview does not exist today because at the time, Hearst did not publish the bylines of their female journalists. So all of her work for the 3 years that she worked for Hearst was filed under her supervisor's name and has been lost by all accounts. She was being erased from history even as she wrote it. Roughly the time she began winding up her journalism career, she met a man named Henri Fiacca. He was a French industrialist. They, of course, fell in love. They got married, and then the Germans invaded France. And like so many women at the time, so many men as well, she had to decide whether she would do something and try to stop the horror that was sweeping over Europe, or she could do nothing. But Nancy Wake was not the kind of woman to do nothing. So she began smuggling first documents and then people from one side of France over the Pyrenees Mountains and into Spain. And she became so successful at this work that the Gestapo put a 5 million franc price on her head, and she ended up being the most wanted person by the Germans throughout the war in any theater. After Nancy fled France, as she had to, she went to England, went to work for the Special Operations Executive, and was eventually flown back to France behind enemy lines, where she led over 7,000 French resistance soldiers into battle against the Germans. So that is the very brief version of what is covered here. None of it spoilers, by the way. That's all on the cover.
Oh man, these are fantastic books, and quite a few of our guests tonight have mentioned how much they've enjoyed reading both of these books. Oh, cool. And so maybe to kind of kick us off, and talking about writing these stories, so in deciding what to write, how do you choose your topic? Do you have a time period or an era you want to write, an event you want to talk about, and these characters just seem to be the ones to tell the stories? Or do you stumble upon a character and then kind of create and research the story from there? If you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah. I know it sounds silly, but I believe that all of my stories have found me. In every case, with every one of my books, I have been minding my own business, sometimes wasting time on the internet, but generally minding my own business. And I had stumbled across an idea. With Codename Helene, I was actually on book tour in Buffalo, New York for my second novel. And the mother of a really good friend of mine emailed me and she said, Ariel, I don't know if you have ever heard about Nancy Wake, but she's beloved down under. My friend is from Australia. She's like, here is an article about her life. I think you need to read it. And you have to write about her next. If you don't write about her next, we can no longer be friends. I mean, you can ask my real mother how much I love to be told what to do. At the time, I was actually contracted to write my novel, I Was Anastasia. So I couldn't abandon everything and work on this one. But when I finally read that article, all of the little hairs stood up on the back of my neck. And that has happened to me with every one of my books. It's like my body knows that this is the story for me. And I read this astonishing story of a woman who wore red lipstick into battle and before she would jump out of a plane, a woman who went from being a journalist to a military leader, a woman who went from interviewing Adolf Hitler to killing a Nazi with her bare hands. And I read that and I thought, I have to tell this story. She should be a household name. I mean, little girls should dress up as Nancy Wake for Halloween. And it kind of became this passion of mine to make sure that people didn't forget who she was and what she did.
Yeah, I think some of the things I do are similar. I think I may do a little bit more looking for the story instead of letting the story find me. I am constantly out there looking, searching, looking at listicles and going to museums and reading books and looking for ideas. And I have a whole file of them. Mm-hmm. And I think, Ariel, you might agree that as you've been published a few times, I think it's harder to find the idea. Publishing changes, trends change. You know, what once was easy was like, oh, I'm just going to write about this. Now, all of a sudden, I have a lot of other people looking over my shoulder at my publisher, weighing in on what they think I should do next. So that has become a little bit harder, I think, for me. I am always, I think, like you, looking for stories that we don't know, you know, or maybe we only know a little bit about them. But for the most part, there's stories that I feel not enough people know about, and I want to change that. I want to rectify that. Yeah. And it tends to be women's stories. I think we can acknowledge that history has been told from a male perspective for too long. So oftentimes they are female stories, although I write about men as well. I will say that I have found my ideas in many different ways, by reading, by going to an art museum once, by just like almost having a book hit me on the top of the head once. But I have been known to go down some paths that didn't work out. Like think, oh, well, this is who I should write about next, because it checked off some kind of business kind of criteria in my head that made sense for my career next. And then I've gone down that path only to find out that it wasn't the right thing. There's research, there's searching, there's business, but there is also some kind of magical element I really can't describe. I have to be able to make these people come to life. That has to speak to me personally. And I don't always get that connection right away, but it comes in the writing or it doesn't. And then that's when I decide this isn't what I should write next. Let me find something else.
That is fascinating. Thank you for answering that. That's something I think a couple of our audience members have wanted to know, and I was indeed curious. So you both mentioned, you know, the research, you know, kind of finding these stories, researching them. So what research do you do? What is your research process? What does that look like?
Once I settle on an idea, I kind of do this deep dive. I've got to find everything I can about that particular moment. And every novel that I've ever written has happened to be in a time period that I know nothing about. I've covered jazz era in New York City. I've covered the last flight of the Hindenburg. I've covered the Russian Revolution, World War II. I just finished another one in a different time period. So I have to become kind of a temporary expert on that moment in history. And I'll buy biographies, I buy history books, I buy whatever I can. A couple times, twice now, I've been lucky enough to write novels about women who have written their own memoirs or autobiographies. And that has been incredibly helpful because I can hear their voice and I can see what the world looked like through their eyes. Sometimes there's nothing and I have to create it from whole cloth. But for me, the first point is to understand the moment in history, obviously from a historical perspective, but culturally, emotionally. And I'm always very concerned with what that time period was like for the women who lived it. I've long said that if you want to know what really happened during any historical event, go find a woman who lived through it and let her tell you, because men tend to be concerned with the big things. If it's war, the bullets and the bombs, whereas women tend to be concerned about the relational complexities and the betrayals and the emotional aspects of living through one of those big moments in time. So I have to build it from the ground up.
Yeah, I'm a little different in that I am an armchair historian. So, even before I started writing historical fiction, I was just a history nerd. And I have a very specific time period that I just am naturally interested in. It's a pretty long one, though. Like I would say from like the 1770s up to present, 1950s, 1970s, perhaps. And all my books have fit in that time period. So I am starting with a base level of knowledge of an era that's higher than a lot of people, I think, so that my research is never as extensive as people think it is. I mean, I certainly knew about the Homestead Act and the Great Plains and the Homesteaders and Manifest Destiny. And I didn't know everything about it. And I did certainly learn a whole lot of interesting things in my research for this novel, but at least I felt comfortable with what were people wearing? How did they speak? What was the transportation? What were the bigger issues in the world that they might have been concerned with? I already kind of know that going in. So that I couldn't, like, there are certain time periods I could never write about. I could never write about the Tudors. I could never write about ancient Rome. Those are just eras that don't interest me personally. So it would be really hard to stay in them and long enough to write a novel about them. You do have to be really comfortable and interested and intrigued by the era you're writing about and the people you're writing about, because you're going to be with them for a real long time as you're writing, and then once the book comes out. So I kind of start at that a little, my baseline might be a little bit higher. I certainly do want to immerse myself in the period, though. I read a lot of old newspapers. I find newspaper archives to be a very, very helpful, source of research. If there is archival footage, video, and not video at the time, but like usually film, like during World War II, when I wrote about Mistress of the Ritz, certainly there is archival footage about that. When I wrote about early Hollywood with the girls in the picture, definitely I watched a whole lot of silent movies. And so that the visual is always really important to me if I can find it, but oftentimes you can't. And so then you just are reading diaries. And I like to read other people's books about the time period, not about maybe the subject I'm writing about, no, but about the time period. So for the Children's Blizzard, I actually reread Willa Cather, who is one of my favorite authors anyway. But I really wanted to reread her books set in the same landscape, in the same country. And she writes about it differently than I did. And I knew that. I'm not trying to imitate, but I just kind of wanted to see her perspective through her writing. I do also find it really helpful to read books written in the time period that I'm writing, even if they're not pertinent to the subject. I just like to hear how people spoke. And I like to know what they were reading and what was really popular at the time.
Well, this really speaks to one of the questions our audience has put forth, and they ask about, what books do you read? Historical fiction? Do you have specific writers? You have mentioned, Melanie, time periods, and kind of how they inspire or guide your writing.
So, what's the question? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't think I understood the question then.
What historical fiction writers do you read, and how do they?
Okay. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you started to answer. I just didn't understand the question.
I love historical fiction. Obviously, it's what I write. I tend to not be able to read it while I'm writing it, mainly because I want to quit and go sit in a corner and cry because I'm comparing my work in progress to somebody else's finished masterpiece. However, if I don't happen to be actively writing, oh gosh, there are so many. I love Diane Setterfield. I love Diana Gabaldon. I love Deanna Rayburn. I'm looking at my shelf here. There are so many good historical fiction novels. Susanna Clark. I want it to be good. I want it to be overwhelming and sweeping. I love Melanie's work. I've read a number of her novels and she is fantastic. Susanna Kersley. I love her work. She does historical fiction mainly centered around Scotland and Ireland. I love series. I love to find an author who has 2, 3, 4, 5 books and I can immerse myself in the world that they have built.
Yeah, I love that too. I read I'm a Catholic reader. I read a lot of everything. I would say the only genres I really don't read are mysteries and sci-fi. Pretty much I'll read anything else though. So I don't kind of only read historical fiction. Historical fiction, I would say, in my library is kind of a smaller proportion of all the books that I have here. It's just because I kind of read everything. And sometimes I may not be categorizing historical fiction as historical fiction. But as far as writers in that genre, I mean, I loved, rest in peace, sadly, Larry McMurtry, one of my absolute favorites, and it was such a loss. Same, along the same vein, E.L. Doctorow remains one of my absolute favorite historical novelists, and I would say his novel, The March, which was based on Sherman's March to the Sea, kind of is one of the reasons I wanted to write historical fiction, I have to say, real frankly. And I also got the idea for writing the autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb by reading Ragtime, because she is mentioned in that. So yeah, I mean, they are just heroes to me. I love Geraldine Brooks. Kate Quinn, I read her Rose Code this year. And I guess I do read while I'm writing, and I will, I don't limit it to not reading historical fiction. I guess like when I read the Rose Code, I was like, damn, she's good. And I know Kate, and she's a wonderful woman. And it just inspired me to work that much harder. That's what reading good books do to me while I'm writing. I just want to rush back and pick up my laptop and write the hell out of what I'm working on, because they just inspire me. And Ariel's novels too. I am Anastasia for sure. I love that. And the Hindenburg one. What was that called?
Flight of Dreams.
Pardon?
Flight of Dreams.
Flight of Dreams. Yes, love that. I love that era, and that whole story. So yes, those two too. So I do think that if you want to be a writer, you have to be a reader. You really, if you're not reading what people are writing today, I don't know how you can write for audiences today. You really have to understand the industry inside and out, but also you just have to love books.
Yeah. When I am writing, I tend to go for contemporary. I'll do thriller. I've read a ton of Stephen King this year. I just finished his new one, Billy Summers, and it was amazing. And I went back and I read some of his, like Shawshank Redemption and The Body and Green Mile, because I have a teenage boy who wants to get into Stephen King. So I'm kind of reading ahead of him, making sure, okay, you can do this one, but not that one. You can do this one, not that one.
I have an anecdote, all right, just mom stuff, that when my oldest son was in 5th grade, his 5th grade teacher called me in to parent-teacher, he was 6th grade, okay. But I was called in for parent-teacher conferences, and he said, do you know your son's reading The Shining? And because they had to have a book, they had this independent reading time, so they always had to have a book, and that's what he wanted to be reading. And I was like, yeah, sure, why? Something wrong with that? And he's like, I just wanted to ask the parent if that was okay. And I was like, fine with me.
Well, with such a background in reading and a love of books, were you both always interested in becoming a published writer? Or is this something that developed or was inspired later?
It is the only thing I have ever wanted to do. Well, I did have a strong desire to be a trauma surgeon at one point. Wow. That obviously did not happen. But I've wanted to be a writer since I was a tiny child, since my mother read to me and I first understood what stories are. And it is the only thing that didn't change. I kind of grew out of my trauma surgeon desire. That's a lot of school.
It's a different skill.
Yes.
It's an entirely different skill set than.
I always joke though, like to be a trauma surgeon, you have to be very calm and collected. And I come from a very long line of women who go totally calm in a crisis. Like if we get lost in the jungle, I will lead us out.
I trust you.
That's where that comes from.
I'm going to be in your party when we get lost in the jungle. But I didn't. I just so contrary. I don't know. I wanted to be an actress. That was my love, was theater and performing, the performing arts, dancing, singing, music. I did, studied singing and piano playing, but the theater, that was my love. And I, unfortunately, in the time period I grew up, in the place I grew up, I did not really have any adults in my life who supported the artistic lifestyle. So I just kind of kept getting shut down at every, like, no, that's not practical. Why would you want to do that? So no one supported my dreams. And after a while of that, I didn't support my dreams. And that's kind of sad. And I still wish I might have done things differently back when I was a young woman. But I was always a reader. And I think my absolute desire to pretend, I was great at pretending growing up. I was always pretending to be other people. That's happen to work out on the stage, but it works out on the page as well. I mean, that's what I'm doing as a writer. I am pretending to be all these different people, whether it's Truman Capote or Babe Paley or Anne-Mara Lindbergh or Raina and Gerda Olsen in the Children's Blizzard. I love becoming all these different people. So I do think it's kind of a natural progression. I didn't study writing at all in school, but it did always come very naturally to me. Whenever I had to do an essay question or write a book report or a theme or whatever, it was always the easy A for me. And I do think you do have to have a talent. You can be taught a lot of things about novel writing, but you have to have some kind of innate talent. So it just worked out that when I stopped acting, a few years went by, and then I started writing, and it kind of felt very seamless to me.
Wonderful. Melanie, we had a question about what drew you to write about the Children's Blizzard.
Well, I was talking to my editor at the time, and I was coming up with the last book of my last contract with Random House at the time, my most recent contract with Random House. And, to be honest, I'll be real frank about the biz. My last two books, the Girls in the Picture and Mistress of the Ritz, had not done as well as some previous titles. So I was feeling that the kind of biographical historical fiction genre was getting a little overplayed. That was just my personal opinion. That it seemed when I first started writing this back in 2010, there weren't a lot of other writers doing it. And in the ensuing years, a lot of others have discovered how much fun it is to discover these great people and bring them to life. But I was like, I don't know who to write about. I mean, I can't find anyone else to write about. I also was not that inspired to keep going down that path at that moment in time, but I did want to write historical fiction for sure. Again, I love history. So I kind of took my page from E.L. Doctorow's book, The March, which was the Sherman's March to the Sea, where he created characters around that. And I thought, why don't I find a real thing that happened that most people don't know about, that I think should be remembered, and then invent characters around that real thing. So that kind of, and my editor just kind of chimed in. She said, and what if there were children involved? And that immediately made me blurt out, what about the Children's Blizzard, which she'd never heard of. And I only knew the basic outline of it through all my crazy historical reading. So I went off and I did some research, and I really thought this would be a great background. I love the idea of writing personal stories, the relationships, the loves, the hopes, the dreams, the pettiness against a big sweeping backdrop. I also was really excited about the challenge of writing about nature in this way, because I had not really done that in any of my novels. The weather, the elements were never really a big part of any of them. And I thought that would be a really interesting challenge to see how many ways I could describe snow. So I went off and I did more research, and I would say the thing that surprised me during the research, there were a couple things. I think I did know, but I didn't know how very young the Prairie school teachers were. I mean, we've all read the Little House on the Prairie books, and Laura went off to teach, when she was like 15 or 16, but I don't know, I don't think I internalized it. But reading about how the immigrants to this country during those years were really brought here through a disinformation campaign, where completely fictional, made up accounts of what awaited them over here were planted in newspapers there to get to come here. And then when they got here, they were so unprepared for what the reality was of this very challenging landscape. I didn't know that at all. We don't learn that in the history books at all. So there were a lot of things I learned about the Black homesteaders. I knew about the Indian schools, but doing a little bit more research, I learned a lot more. The Prairie Madness. I really wanted to write about that. What happened to women when they were uprooted from their homes and the elements drove them crazy out alone on the prairie. What could that do to a person? And I wrote a character, Anna Peterson, who kind of embodies that. So I did learn a lot, even though I thought I knew a lot about this era. I learned an awful lot more writing it.
Well, and Ariel, I think that question can also kind of go to you. When you were writing Codename Helene, did you learn anything that surprised you, or that I don't know, kind of really stood out to you during that writing?
So much. And the funny thing is, I'd always sworn I would never cover World War II. There have been so many stories, and they're so good, and I didn't think there was anything left to tell. And it's such a big market, and it seems to be an evergreen market. People don't seem to get tired of the stories, but I thought, I'm not going to cover that one because it's been covered. I'm going to find something that hasn't been covered. And when this story came to me, I was just like, oh, dang it, here we are. But what was fascinating to me is there have been any number of stories written about female spies during World War II, and they were intrepid and incredible. But Nancy Wake was the only military leader that I had personally come across. And I just found it astonishing how the English could drop a woman out of a plane into the forest and she could assume command of 7,000 men. And what she had to do to get their respect, and quickly. She didn't have years to earn their respect. She had hours, maybe days. And I found it fascinating that she was able to do it. And in a very short amount of time, an entire army looked at her as their leader and they fell in line. And I wanted to know what kind of woman could do that. Who did she have to be in order to make that happen? And she was bold and brassy, and she cussed like a sailor, and she could drink everyone under her command under the table. She had a hollow leg. But at the same time, she was wise and she was funny. This is probably the funniest novel I've ever written. And it sounds odd because it's a novel about World War II. It has some teeth. I mean, I really go for the jugular in a handful of places. But she was a funny woman, and she brought this levity to the story that was this fabulous balance to just some of the horrors of war. And I found it really fun getting to know this woman. And I found myself thinking, I would have liked to know her. I would have really liked to know her in real life.
You know, so I'm going to ask, because that sounds like, I haven't read Codename Helene yet. I'm so sorry. Mistress of the Ritz that I wrote, that was also a World War II story that I said I was never ever going to write about World War II either. But is also, I think, one of my funniest books because of the type of character the woman, the real woman, Blanche Ozella was that I was writing about. Do you think that that's typical, that time period of women in that time period, that there was so much, I don't know, horror around them, and I mean, there's just this kind of elan, right? Like this, I don't know. That's so interesting that you said that, because I felt that about Blanche as well when I was writing about her.
I think, this is just my opinion, I can't say for sure, but I think the kind of woman that is drawn toward that specific kind of work has to have a lot of metal in her spine, and she has to be incredibly confident and sure of herself and able to speak her mind. And personally, in my life, the women that fit that category, they're all funny. I think it was the type of woman that was drawn to do dangerous things. So there's got to be a sense of levity there as well.
And also kind of like a, not devil may care, but you know, like
a nonchalant.
No bullshit. Yeah, nonchalant, but no bullshit detector. It's like, you know, I don't know. It's funny though. Now I got to read the book because it's going to make me think of Blanche in my book. So I think that's just really interesting that you described that book that way, because I would have described Mistress of the Ritz in the same way.
Yeah, and I read Mistress of the Ritz. It was funny and it was great, and she was great. I don't know. It's probably a commonality that would draw, because women did any number of amazing things, but that was a very specific to work with the French resistance to undermine the Nazis while they're right in front of you, or to go into battle against them. And with Nancy, she killed a man with her bare hands. She killed a Nazi with her bare hands. It's astonishing to me. So she had to be bold. She had to be brassy. I mean, she was fun.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about, you both mentioned characters and to some degree the impact that these stories or these characters have had on you as writers. You know, what do you hope readers take away from your stories or these characters and their lives?
Well, for me, it was just important that people knew who Nancy was. It bothers me that her work, the work that she did as a journalist, is lost and that she never got credit for it. It bothers me that she was the most decorated woman of World War II and I'd never heard her name, because she wasn't American and she wasn't a man. She doesn't exist in American textbooks, but this is a woman who did astonishing things. And I keep saying that I'm going to send my entire library of books to the first person that sends me a picture of their little girl dressed up as Nancy Wake for Halloween. I want it to happen at least once. I just think it's sad that she's been lost to history, and I would love for her to be a household name. That was my motivation with her, because she inspired me, and I thought she would absolutely inspire others if they only knew her story.
For me, it's different with every book, what I hope the reader will take away, because every book has its own message, and what I want to say in it is very specific to the book. So with the children's blizzard, I would say, I think my overriding desire here was to write a grown-up, more realistic version of Little House on the Prairie. We all loved those books when we were young. I certainly did as an adult in 2021. I certainly see the problems in those books. And, when you just look at them, it's just, it's a white American family's version of what happened, when the reality is there were so many other people who weren't white American who were doing the same thing. And that the two main, Paul and Ma in those books always bugged me for different reasons. I mean, I think Paul was completely bonkers and insane for continually dragging his family all around the Great Plains, and Ma is just too much of a saint, always smiling serenely and packing up the wagon and going. And I thought, it couldn't have been that easy, right? I mean, yes, these were women of courage, but the toll that it took to do that, and the toll that the land took on the people, and that the elements took on the people, was enormous and great, and it impacted them for generations. The children of the children's blizzard were the grandparents during the Dust Bowl in this same part of our country. So I thought that was really important. But I also just wanted to say that whenever mankind kind of thinks we've gotten the better of the elements, right? We can predict the weather, we can tame it, we can bend it to our will. Mother Nature is always going to say, no, you can't. But it ultimately is the human spirit that unites us and will heal us, I think, in the end.
Well, thank you for that. Speaking of, the environment, you both have written books from that take place in many different environments, many different locales. So how important is place in developing your novels? And is it difficult to recreate some of these spaces, whether it be, being over in, a battlefield of World War II, the Great Plains, the Ritz during World War II, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think every book brings its particular challenges. So I think of specifically my second novel, Flight of Dreams. The entire thing takes place on the last flight of the Hindenburg. So it begins when it takes off and it ends when it crashes. So there was no nature. Nobody got to go for a swim or take a walk or pluck a flower or look at a tree. They were in this ship for 3.5 days. It was really claustrophobic, but that ship itself ended up becoming almost a character in the book itself, because I had to make it real, and they had to live in this tight, confined space. And I knew nothing about Zeppelins when I began writing that book. I knew absolutely nothing. And over a very short amount of time, I became this expert on it. My husband would grill me at night and he'd be like, how high did it fly? And how fast was it going? And he would open up the schematics and he would ask me questions about the structure and the hydrogen bladders and all this kind of stuff. And I got to where I knew everything there was to know about that one particular airship. And it was all set in this place. And I had to do the same with Jazz Area, New York City, or the different places where the Romanov family went during the Russian Revolution. This one, most of it takes place in the forest of France. There's some in Paris, there's some in England, but most of it is rustic and rural. As Nancy Wake says in her autobiography, they were out there living rough as guts, unpacking crates of weapons in the middle of the night. And my job is to make it feel real. My job is to make it feel like the reader is really there. And for that to happen, I have to understand how that scenery actually worked, like what was actually happening with those airdrops of weapons, that kind of thing.
For me, it's different with every book. Not every book is about the place. I would say Oxford, Alice, I Have Been in 2010, when that one came out, certainly was about the place, but I had no money and I couldn't go there. So I had to rely on, textbooks and photographs of the time. A couple of my books, like Aviator's Wife, really wasn't about a place, so I didn't go anywhere to research that book. Some of the books I have, certainly I did find a reason to go to the Ritz in Paris for Mistress of the Ritz, because, my one and only chance to do that. And it made sense there because I wanted the Ritz to be a character of the book. And the Ritz hasn't changed that much. Now, that's the delicate balance you do when you're writing historical fiction. You may want to say, I'm going to go to Hollywood to research this book that I'm setting in Hollywood in 1910. But Hollywood doesn't look anything like it did in 1910. And so it doesn't always make sense in that way unless you just really want a tax write-off vacation. And you'll do some research, but so you do kind of have to more and more rely, when you're writing about the past, you do have to rely on things you can't see with your own eyes. It doesn't always make sense to go to the place. I did not go to Nebraska, although I've been to Nebraska and South Dakota before. Even though the topography you might think is the same as it was in 1888, it really isn't. The trees that you have there now were not planted yet when these people were there. The buildings for sure. That was an area I just knew just from many, many trips driving from Chicago to Denver to see my son. So I know that I knew that area. So I did not go specifically there. And no, I did not go out in the middle of a blizzard. I've had many people ask me that if I just decided to wander out without a hat and coat in the blizzard while I was writing. It's like, no, there's an imagination. That's why we use the imagination. Although I did watch Dr. Zhivago quite a lot, and I'm not kidding. It's a great visual presentation of snow and ice. So, yeah.
Well, Ariel, here's a question for you. Have you ever been able to interview anyone connected with one of your stories?
I have purposefully not tried. So the story that I'm writing is my version of that. And for the most part, the people that I've written about are no longer alive. Actually, none of the people that I've written about specifically are alive any longer. I have had to rebuild their stories from historical texts or from source documents. What is interesting, however, is that with every single one of my novels, somebody related to, either really related to or who knew my characters, has contacted me. I've gotten emails from grandchildren of characters. I met a man who went on the Hindenburg when he was 13 years old, right before it set off for its last flight. He came to a book signing of mine, and I ended up giving him the microphone, and he told the entire crowd what it was like on the inside. He became an engineer because his dad took him to see the Hindenburg. I've gotten emails from people that knew one of my characters, and I was Anastasia. I got an email from the woman who did the genetic research. She was the one who did the genetic sequencing that determined whether or not Anna Anderson really was Anastasia Romanov. And she wrote me after she read the book and told me what it felt like to stand there on the campus of that university and be the only person on planet Earth who actually knew for sure in that moment. Wow. I have gotten emails from people that knew Nancy Wake that were friends with her. So I haven't ever been able to interview the subject. I don't think I would ever write about somebody who is still alive, to be honest with you. But on the back end, I have met all of these interesting people that knew the people that I wrote about. And thankfully, in every one of those cases, they have said, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you got it right. You got it right. It was amazing. And that has always been really gratifying to me.
Oh, that's amazing. But I'm a historian at a university, and so just those connections that are formed through these conversations and through these emails, that is phenomenal. Wow. I think we have time for one or two more questions. If anyone has a final kind of burning question they'd really like to ask. One of my questions, when we're in developing this research and building these books, what do you do when you stumble upon kind of a gap in the research or a gap in the knowledge? What do you do next?
For me, that's the fun part. I
Yeah.
I tend to think the story is actually in the gaps of things that we know for sure. We have dates, we have times, we have facts and figures. There are things that we really can't mess with in the historical record, but we don't know what people said behind a closed door. If somebody disappears for 3 days and we have no way to verify where they went, that's where the room for my novel opens up. That's where I tend to go, oh, I can make this connection, or I need to get this person from here to there. And since I don't really know where they were during that weekend, I can put them on a train to Paris. I don't ever see those as obstacles. I see that as an opportunity to tell the story that I need to tell, which is always in some capacity going to deviate from the truth because it is a novel. And there always reaches a point when I'm telling a story where I have to make a choice to deviate in a small or large way. And if I do, I fess up to it at the end. And that's why it's shelved in fiction, because it's a story.
I think I approach it the same way as you do. I've learned through, after I wrote my first historical, which was Alice I Have Been, and I didn't know that I was writing historical fiction. I just thought it was a really great story. And I knew certain things happen, and I get to make up everything in between, not realizing that some people would get hung up on that. And so then the next book I thought I was going to write, I ended up over-researching it to the point where I had no room for my imagination to fill in the gaps. So since then, I've kind of settled on what works for me is like, I don't want to read every letter. I don't want to know every detail. That's writing nonfiction, and that's great. But what we do, like you said, I'm looking for the room to tell the story, the personal things as I see it based on research, but it's still my imagination of what went on behind the closed doors of history. And the more doors that are closed, the better for me as a novelist.
Well, I mean, this is a historical novel and it's based on history, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this is my version of her life. And I have done everything that I can to be as faithful as I can to her life and to her story, but it's still my version of it. And if she were here, I would beg her forgiveness. She's not, so I have to beg the reader's forgiveness. And I always own up to that at the end of the book. In my author's notes, I will explain why I made the choices that I did. And mainly I'm hoping that the reader falls in love with the character the way that I did. And if they want to know more, there are always resources. They can go read her autobiography and get the straight account. This is just my version.
Yeah, I mean, I've had relatives and friends of people I've written about contact me, and it's always nice when they say that's exactly how she was. I mean, but I don't know that I start out that way. Like, it's like you and I could both look at the same research for a certain subject, and we'd come up with completely different books about it. Exactly. Because it's our take on the facts. And, you know, we have, every author we're coming from a different place, right? And for our different experiences, they all kind of get meshed into that together.
The thing nobody ever really talks about much, and it's true whether you're writing historical fiction or a space opera or a thriller, you put yourself on the page. So much of who you are as an author, the way you see the world, the things you believe, the things that you find funny or scary or heartbreaking, that's what ends up on the page. So when somebody loves a book, part of what they're loving is the part of you that you put there. Or if somebody really hates my book,
like the book.
part of what they're not enjoying is the parts of me that I put on the page. And that's where, writers can be touchy-feely about those things, I guess, but that's sometimes where the critique and the reviews can hurt, because we put so much of ourselves there, even when it's not obvious.
Yeah, good point. I don't think of myself as writing, because I'm writing historical fiction. I don't think it's me. But when I wrote Alice I Have Been, my oldest son read it, which completely was not in his wheel. He's the one who read The Shining, in fifth grade. So not really his kind of book. But I mean, he said, because there was a big part of the book where the main character has 3 sons and she sends them off to war, and their relationships in that time period. And I am a mother of 2 sons. And my sons completely saw through, and they said, oh, so that son, that was really kind of me. And then that son, that was kind of my brother. And I was like, I didn't think of it that way. Swear to goodness, I didn't intend to do it that way. But I think they were right.
I don't know that I've ever consciously put myself there, but the people that know me really well, when they read my books, they go, oh my gosh, that thing she said or that thing she did, that was
I get that a lot.
Yeah.
I get that a lot from the people in my family or in my close personal sphere of things. In fact, a really good friend of mine, Jess, was listening to the audiobook of Mistress, and he said that. He goes, oh man, I mean, when she said this, I heard you saying it. This is something I would completely hear you say, or the way, and again, I don't intend it because I really am trying to be these other people, but you can't help it.
Well, there's no barrier. I think at the end of the day, there's no barrier between the brain and the page. It's there.
Yeah.
That is beautifully said. Unfortunately, our time together has come to a conclusion. I mean, is there a final teaser or a hint of what is currently being worked on before we close?
I can tell you what I just finished if you want to hear it.
I think they do, yes.
So I just finished a novel that is tentatively called The Frozen River. And it is based on the life of a woman named Martha Ballard. She was a midwife in the late 1700s in Maine. She delivered over 1,000 babies in her career and never lost a mother in childbirth, which is astonishing because doctors today can't boast a record like that. But the reason that I wrote her story is that she kept a diary for the 30 years that she was a midwife. And in this diary is recorded every birth, every death, every scandal, every murder. And it also contains the only written record of a rape trial that changed the legal system in our country.
Wow.
So
That's great.
It's a murder mystery and a rape trial, a murder mystery and a rape trial. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So my next book, I had actually took a little bit of a break between books. So my next book won't be out until 2023, fingers crossed. I'm still writing it. It is, I cannot say what it's about, but I will say it's kind of what, if you shivered while you read The Children's Blizzard, you're going to wear sunglasses when you read this next one. And so it's kind of opposite that way. And it is, again, inventing characters, but this time it's kind of about a cultural moment in America and a specific place that I am inventing a story about mothers and daughters and sisters around. And that's all I'll say.
Well, I think everyone is putting these on some to-order lists and getting to their local bookstore and to go seek these out. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing. It has just been an incredible panel and an incredible evening together. And so on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, thank you to our presenters for sharing your expertise and your stories. I learned so much. And thanks to all of you on Zoom and on Facebook for attending this year. We appreciate your time and for joining us in these conversations. Don't forget to visit our website, southdakota.bookfestival.com/virtual for more great programming to come through our virtual 2021 South Dakota Festival of Books. Have a wonderful evening and thank you again.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I loved being here.
Yeah. Bye, Ariel. Hope we'll see you again
soon.
Sometime.
Yes, very soon.
Yay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.